Some families ask for a favor. Mine decided to wrap a ribbon around my life savings and hand it to my sister as a holiday gift. I sat at a holiday dinner table surrounded by 15 cheering relatives, while my father handed my younger sister the key to my $450,000 condo. A key he took from my own purse. They did not ask me. They just expected me to pack my bags and walk away from the only home I ever owned, because in their minds, her needs eclipsed my existence. I did not scream. I just smiled, clapped, and sold the property to a cash buyer before the new year. Welcome back to Still Drama Stories. Get comfortable. If you have ever watched your own parents treat your hard work like a charity fund for their favorite child, you're in the right place. Drop a comment with your age and let me know if your family ever weaponized a beautiful tradition just to empty your pockets. Subscribe and stay with me because the trap they set for me was nothing compared to the one they walked into. My name is Suri Alva. I am 32 years old and I live in Honolulu, Hawaii. I earned my space here the hard way. I work as an IT manager for a statewide healthcare network, a title that translates to 60-hour workweeks, late-night server migrations, and a phone that never stops buzzing. But the payoff was my sanctuary. A 2-bedroom condo on the 15th floor in Waikiki. When I slide my glass doors open in the morning, the trade winds carry the smell of salt and plumeria right into my kitchen. I bought it with my own money. I saved for a decade skipping vacations and wearing cheap shoes so I could put down the payment. My parents Brenda and Tom moved to Oahu from Ohio 8 years ago. They traded snow shovels for sunscreen and adopted local customs like tourists hoarding souvenirs. Their favorite acquisition was the concept of ohana. In Hawaiian culture, ohana signifies a profound bond of mutual respect, love, and shared responsibility. In my mother's mouth, the word operated as a collection agency. The warning signs started in early November. I was standing in my kitchen pouring a cup of dark roast coffee before logging into an early morning staff meeting. My phone vibrated on the quartz counter. The screen showed Brenda's name. I let it ring a few times, watching a white boat cut across the blue water down below before answering. Brenda did not say good morning. She let out a sharp, practiced sigh. The sound of a woman carrying burdens she invented herself. Your sister is losing her mind in that tiny rental, Suri. Seth tripped over a baby gate again this morning. They are suffocating in there. I kept my voice level. It is a small place. They will figure it out. We all need to figure it out, Brenda corrected. Her tone shifted from weary martyr to project manager. Ohana Suri. Nobody gets left behind. You have 2 whole bedrooms over there, for one person. It hurts my heart seeing Lauren struggle while you sit on all this empty space. I gripped the ceramic handle of my coffee mug. The guest room was not empty space. It held my monitors, my servers, and the desk where I earned the money to pay the mortgage. It was the engine of my life. My guest room is my office. Mom, I work from home. Brenda made a clicking sound with her tongue. You fiddle with routers, Suri. You can do that from anywhere. A studio apartment, a coffee shop. Lauren is bringing new life into this world. She is building a real family. That was how Brenda always framed it. My career, the one that kept a roof over my head, was a hobby. Lauren's chaotic life was a sacred mission. Lauren is 29 years old. She is married to Seth, a man who calls himself a serial entrepreneur. In reality, Seth starts businesses that fail within 6 months, leaving debts that my parents quietly absorb. They fund his failed app ideas and cover their rent shortfalls. Now Lauren was pregnant with her second child, and the financial strain was showing. Instead of asking Seth to get a stable job, my parents were surveying my life for spare parts. I told Brenda that my condo was not a real estate solution for Seth's bad business planning. The line went silent. In my family, silence does not mean they have accepted a boundary. It means they are mapping a way around it. We will discuss this properly at Thanksgiving, Brenda said. The line clicked dead. She left the demand hanging in the air right next to the smell of my coffee. I set the phone down and looked around my kitchen. The stainless steel appliances, the clean counters, the quiet peace I had built with my own hands. They wanted it, and they believed that throwing the word ohana at me was the only payment required. I went back to my desk and opened my laptop. I pushed the conversation out of my mind, assuming it was just another guilt trip. Just Brenda being Brenda. I did not realize she had already laid the foundation for a theft. I did not realize that in a few short weeks, she would try to take the keys right out of my hands. To understand the machinery of my family, you have to understand the centerpiece they built it around. My younger sister Lauren is 29 years old. She possesses a specific, practiced fragility, the kind that makes other people rush forward to open doors, pay bills, and clear obstacles from her path. She does not ask for help. She performs distress until someone else volunteers to fix it. Lauren is married to Seth. Seth is 31, wears designer sneakers, and introduces himself as a serial entrepreneur. In reality, Seth is a financial sinkhole. During the 5 years they have been married, he has launched a premium artisanal ice delivery service, a luxury surfboard wax subscription box, and an app for matching dog walkers that he never actually finished coding. Every single venture collapses under a pile of unpaid vendor invoices and breached leases. When the creditors start calling, Lauren starts crying. And when Lauren cries, my parents spring into action. Brenda and Tom are retired. Their pensions are modest. They cannot afford to bail out Seth round after round, so they found a silent partner. Me. The pattern established itself years ago. A phone call would come late on a Sunday. Brenda would use her hushed, urgent voice explaining that Lauren and Seth were facing a temporary setback. A bridge loan was needed to keep their electricity on or to stop their car from being repossessed. Brenda would invoke the sacred concept of Ohana. She would remind me that we are a unit that island culture dictates we protect our own. I would transfer the funds. The bridge was never crossed back, the loans silently converted into gifts, and the subject was permanently closed. While I spent my 20s tracking every dollar on color-coded spreadsheets, eating cheap takeout, and driving a reliable 10-year-old sedan, Lauren and Seth leased a European SUV because Seth claimed a visionary must project wealth to attract capital. They ordered expensive meal kits. They took weekend trips to Maui to decompress from the stress of their own poor decisions. My disciplined financial planning became the safety net for their chaos. The bank of mom and dad was an illusion. It was always the Bank of Surrey. If you want to know the true depth of her entitlement, you only need to look at what happened 2 years ago during her first pregnancy. Brenda called me in tears a month before the baby shower. She insisted that booking the local community center was too depressing for the first grandchild of the family. She wanted to host the event at the Pacific Club, an exclusive venue with ocean views and a staggering minimum spend. Brenda claimed the stress of planning a subpar party was aggravating her heart murmur. It was a masterful manipulation. I wrote the check. I covered the $5,000 venue fee, the floral arches woven with fresh orchids, and a towering display of custom French macarons. I worked overtime for a month to absorb the cost. On the day of the shower, I stood near the back of the room holding a paper plate of finger sandwiches. Lauren stood in the center of the hall wearing a silk maternity gown inspecting the dessert table. She did not look at me. She did not walk over to say thank you for funding the entire afternoon. Instead, she frowned at the dessert display, turned to our mother, and let out a tragic sigh. She complained that the macarons were the wrong shade of blush pink. She said the color clashed with her dress and ruined the aesthetic of her photographs. I watched my sister cry over pastry colors while spending my money. I stood there and realized my sacrifice was not viewed as a gift. It was viewed as a baseline expectation, a tax I owed simply for existing in her shadow. Now Lauren was pregnant with her second child, and the stakes were escalating. The subtle requests for cash were transforming into a targeted campaign for real estate. A week after Brenda called me about my condo, I drove to my parents' house in Kailua for our customary Sunday dinner. The evening air was thick with humidity and the smell of roasted pork. I walked into the living room and found Lauren executing her latest performance. She arrived carrying her toddler on her hip, dropped a heavy designer diaper bag onto the hardwood floor, and collapsed onto the sofa. She began the routine immediately. The tears welled up in her eyes, perfectly timed. She wiped her cheeks, ensuring everyone in the room noticed her suffering. She started talking about her current 2-bedroom rental. She did not just say it was small, she called it a hazard. She spun a narrative of danger and deprivation. She claimed the toddler's toys were creeping into the living space, creating a treacherous environment where Seth frequently tripped and injured himself. She wept about the lack of square footage, stating she could not possibly bring a fragile newborn into a home without a dedicated soundproof nursery. Her voice wavered as she described the indignity of sharing a single bathroom. She painted a picture of a family teetering on the edge of survival, ignoring the fact that their rental was in a highly desirable neighborhood and cost more per month than my mortgage. Tom shook his head, his face etched with deep, performative concern. Brenda sat beside Lauren, stroking her hair and murmuring soothing affirmations. Then the synchronized pivot occurred, the moment they had been rehearsing. Brenda looked across the coffee table directly at me. She did not ask a question. She simply stated an observation. Surrey has so much room in Waikiki. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, high security, a dedicated parking structure. It is such a safe building for children. Tom chimed in, nodding slowly. A lot of wasted space for someone who just types on a keyboard all day. A young family needs room to breathe. I sat in an armchair holding a glass of iced tea, feeling the cold condensation against my palm. The psychological toll of these dinners was a physical weight on my chest. I spent my days managing complex server infrastructure, mitigating digital disasters, and keeping entire hospital systems online. I thrived on logic structure and earned results. To leave my structured world and enter my parents' house was to step into an alternate reality where logic was penalized and manipulation was rewarded. I looked at my sister sobbing on the couch while wearing a gold watch purchased with my previous bailouts. I looked at my parents nodding in agreement, mentally carving up the sanctuary I built. I did not take the bait. I took a sip of my tea and changed the subject to the weather. They dropped the conversation, but the air in the room grew heavy. The silence was not a surrender. It was the quiet before a storm. I drove home that night, gripping the steering wheel, calculating the exact perimeter of my life. I knew every dollar in my accounts. I knew the equity in my condo. I knew the exact price of my independence. Lauren only knew how to demand a future. I knew how to build one. As November crept closer to Thanksgiving, the hints grew sharper. The phone calls from Brenda doubled in frequency, always looping back to the theme of Ohana sacrifice and the tragic lack of space for my future niece or nephew. I told myself they were just talking. I clung to the rational belief that no matter how entitled my sister was, my parents could not force me to hand over a deed to real property. I assumed my family still operated within the ultimate boundaries of the law. But rational thought is useless against unchecked entitlement. They viewed my boundaries as a temporary obstacle, an annoyance that could be flattened by enough social pressure. I spent my time ignoring the noise, assuming I was safe behind the locked door of my own home. I did not realize they were tired of asking for favors. They were preparing to make a demand. As the holidays approached, the casual hints morphed into a coordinated siege. I prepared a simple side dish for the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner, entirely unaware that the actual menu involved serving my future on a silver platter. Thanksgiving in Honolulu carries a different rhythm than the holidays I remember from my childhood in Ohio. There is no frost on the windows, no brisk autumn chill to justify the heavy sweaters my mother still insists on wearing. Instead, the relentless afternoon sun bakes the driveway, and the ceiling fans spin in futile circles, trying to push the humidity out of the dining room. I arrived at my parents' house, carrying a glass dish of roasted sweet potatoes, a recipe I spent 3 hours preparing. I walked through the front door, expecting the usual passive remarks about my career or my wardrobe. I did not expect to walk into a synchronized theater production. The dining table was set with Brenda's good china, the floral plates she reserves for occasions where she wants to project the image of a flawless matriarch. Lauren was already seated, positioned directly across from my usual chair. Seth sat next to her, tapping at his smartphone, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. He recently abandoned his dog-walking app project, claiming the market was not ready for his vision. His failure meant their financial anxiety was peaking, and the tension in the room felt thick enough to choke on. We moved through the initial motions of the meal. The passing of serving bowls, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, the superficial updates about neighborhood gossip. I kept my answers short, sticking to neutral topics. I praised the texture of the stuffing. I asked Tom about his golf handicap. I operated like a technician navigating a fragile network, carefully avoiding any wires that might spark a system failure. Then, right as Tom began carving the second half of the turkey, the orchestrated pivot began. Lauren set her fork down. She pressed her hand against her pregnant stomach and let out a trembling sigh. The sound was designed to pull the attention of the entire room, a gravitational shift that demanded an audience. Tears pooled in her eyes, welling up with a speed that required years of practice. She stared directly across the table, locking her gaze onto mine. "I just do not know how we are going to manage it," Lauren whispered, her voice cracking in all the right places. "The walls in that apartment are closing in on us. Yesterday I tried to figure out where to put the new bassinet, and the only space left is inside the hallway closet. My baby is going to sleep in a closet surrey." She swiped a tear from her cheek. Seth looked down at his plate, playing the part of the defeated provider. "It is suffocating." Lauren continued, her voice rising an octave to ensure the tragedy registered. "I wake up panicking every single night. We are trapped in that tiny box, and I feel like I am failing my children before this new one is even born." She kept her eyes fixed on me. She was not seeking comfort. She was demanding a rescue. Before I could form a neutral response, the flanking maneuver commenced. Brenda reached across the table and placed her hand over Lauren's, offering a look of profound theatrical sorrow. Then my mother turned her attention to me. The sorrow vanished from her expression, replaced by a hardened, judgmental stare. "Ohana means nobody gets left behind." "Surrey," Brenda stated, her tone dripping with unearned moral authority. She wielded the Hawaiian word like a blunt instrument, twisting a beautiful cultural ethos into a crowbar to pry open my assets. Tom set the carving knife down on the serving platter. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the table, presenting a united front with my mother. "You have all that space just for yourself," he added, his voice low and heavy with disappointment. "2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, it is selfish." The word hung in the humid air above the roasted turkey and the cranberry sauce. Selfish. They hurled the accusation with practiced ease, expecting me to shrink under the weight of their disapproval. They expected the familiar cycle to play out. The guilt trip would be applied, the pressure would mount, and I would eventually open my wallet to buy my way back into their good graces. A younger version of myself might have crumbled. A younger version might have offered to pay a portion of Lauren's rent for a larger place, or offered to cover the deposit on a townhome just to make the accusations stop. But the woman sitting at that table was an IT manager who spent her days securing digital perimeters against relentless external attacks. I knew how to recognize a breach, and I knew how to deploy a firewall. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my choices. I did not outline the decade of grueling work, the skipped meals, or the relentless saving required to purchase my sanctuary. Explaining yourself to a manipulator is just handing them a map of your vulnerabilities. Instead, I met my father's stare. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands folded neatly in my lap. "My condo isn't an option," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of any emotional static. "I worked for it, and it is mine." I did not offer an apology. I did not soften the blow with a maybe or a perhaps. I delivered a concrete boundary, solid and impenetrable. What happened next was the most unsettling part of the entire evening. In a normal family, a blunt refusal might spark an argument. Feelings would be hurt, voices might elevate, and a genuine conflict would erupt. But my family does not operate on genuine emotion. They operate on strategy. The moment the boundary was set, the tears stopped. Lauren blinked, the tragic sorrow evaporating from her face instantly. She picked up her fork and pierced a piece of asparagus. Tom leaned back in his chair, picking up the carving knife as if the conversation had never happened. Brenda turned her head, offering a bright synthetic smile to my brother-in-law. "Seth," she chirped, her voice light and conversational. "Would you like some more dark meat? We have plenty of gravy left." The subject was dropped, abruptly, seamlessly. The transition was so jarring it left a ringing sensation in my ears. I sat there chewing food that tasted like ash, surrounded by the eerie silence of a discarded agenda. They did not push back. They did not argue my refusal. They just shifted gears and began discussing a recent television show they had watched. I realized then that in my family, silence does not signify acceptance. Silence means they are recalculating the route. If you have ever dealt with a narcissist or a chronic manipulator, you need to understand the anatomy of this specific kind of quiet. Let me speak directly to you for a moment. When a person who feels entitled to your resources suddenly stops demanding them, they have not seen the error of their ways. They have not respected your boundary. They have simply realized that a frontal assault will not work. Manipulators always back down right before they strike their hardest blow. They retreat to lull you into a false sense of security. They want you to believe the conflict has passed, that you have successfully defended your territory. While you are exhaling in relief, they are quietly circling to the back door picking the lock. That eerie silence at the Thanksgiving table was not a surrender. It was a drafting board. My mother's bright smile and my father's casual offer of more turkey were the tools of misdirection. I left their house that evening feeling a lingering heavy dread settling in my chest. The drive back to Waikiki usually cleared my head, but that night the city lights blurred together. I parked in my secure garage, rode the elevator to the 15th floor, and locked my deadbolt behind me. I walked through my quiet, spacious condo, running my hand along the cool granite of the kitchen island. I knew they were not finished. The swiftness of their retreat meant they were planning a bypass. They did not argue because they had already decided my input was irrelevant. They no longer viewed my home as my property. They viewed it as a family asset that I was temporarily, stubbornly hoarding. The Thanksgiving setup was merely a stress test. They pushed the wall to see if it would yield. When it held firm, they decided to stop pushing and start plotting a demolition. I spent the month of December waiting for the other shoe to drop, unaware that they were preparing an ambush so audacious it would permanently alter the trajectory of all our lives. The countdown to Christmas had begun and the trap was set. December 24th arrived with a heavy downpour that turned the lush green mountains of Oahu a deep charcoal gray. The rain hammered against the roof of my parents' house in Kailua, forcing everyone indoors. The living space was bursting with a chaotic, suffocating energy. 15 extended relatives had flown in from Ohio to escape the mainland winter, turning the normally quiet suburban home into a crowded theater. Aunts, uncles, and cousins filled every available chair, loudly reminiscing over shared histories and sipping rum punch. The air hung thick with the humidity of the storm, the sweet smell of roasted pork, and an invisible vibrating tension that I felt the moment I walked through the front door. I arrived wearing a simple linen dress, carrying a tray of appetizers I had spent the morning preparing. Upon entering, I followed the usual family protocol. I walked down the hall to the guest bedroom, a space currently overflowing with suitcases and damp raincoats. I set my leather purse down on the corner of the bed, burying it slightly under a pile of jackets to keep it out of the way. I thought nothing of leaving my bag unattended in a house full of relatives. You do not guard your personal belongings around blood. You operate under the naive assumption that a shared last name provides a baseline of safety. That was my crucial error. The evening progressed with the loud performative cheerfulness typical of large gatherings. Long folding tables had been pushed together in the center of the living room, draped with red and green tablecloths to accommodate the crowd. Lauren held court at the center of the arrangement. She wore a fitted emerald dress that accentuated her pregnancy, accepting compliments from our aunts with practiced humility. Seth sat beside her, swirling an expensive glass of scotch he did not purchase, offering vague updates about an upcoming business venture that would supposedly change the world. Brenda floated around the room, directing the chaos with a bright, tight smile, ensuring every guest had a full plate and a front-row seat to her flawless hosting abilities. I took a seat near the edge of the table, flanked by Uncle Dave, who spent 20 minutes complaining about the cost of rental cars, and a cousin who kept asking if I still worked in computer repair. I did not correct her. I ate my roasted pork in relative silence, scanning the room. My father, Tom, was unusually jovial. His cheerfulness felt strained, an artificial performance layered over a deep, hidden objective. He kept checking his watch, pacing near the kitchen island, waiting for a specific cue. Once the dinner plates were cleared and Brenda brought out the dessert trays, the ambient noise in the room reached a crescendo. Relatives were laughing, glasses were clinking, and the sugar high of the evening was taking hold. Tom stood up from his chair at the head of the table. He picked up his wine glass and a silver dessert fork. He tapped the metal against the crystal. The sharp, clear rings cut through the laughter, demanding immediate compliance. The 15 relatives quieted down, turning their attention to the patriarch of the family. Tom cleared his throat, letting a warm, benevolent smile spread across his face. He looked around the room, making eye contact with his brothers and sisters, weaving a spell of familial unity. "It has been a wonderful year," Tom began, his voice projecting across the crowded space. "Having all of you here under one roof reminds Brenda and me of what truly matters: family. The bonds we share, the sacrifices we make for one another." He shifted his gaze to Lauren and Seth. Lauren looked up, her eyes already shimmering with anticipated emotion. We all know Lauren and Seth have been facing some challenges with their living situation. Tom continued his tone, softening into a register of profound paternal concern. Bringing a new life into the world requires stability, safety, and room to grow. As parents, there is nothing Brenda and I want more than to see our children thrive. But sometimes the greatest blessings do not come from parents. Sometimes they come from the siblings who understand the true meaning of Ohana. My heart skipped a singular heavy beat. The blood drained from my face, rushing straight to my feet. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Tom reached into the pocket of his trousers. He did not look at me. His eyes remained fixed on my sister. He pulled his hand out, holding a shiny brass key tied with a festive red ribbon. The metal glinted under the dining room chandelier. "We have a Christmas miracle to announce tonight," Tom declared, his voice ringing with triumphant authority. "Suri has generously agreed to gift her condo to her sister for the new baby." The words struck me like physical blows. The sheer staggering audacity of the statement paralyzed my vocal cords. "She will be moving into a modest rental after the holiday," Tom added, sealing the narrative with a heavy coat of nobility. "Because in this family, we take care of our own. Family comes first." Tom walked around this table and handed the ribbon-tied key to Lauren. The dining room erupted. The 15 extended relatives broke into rapturous applause. Aunt Karen let out a loud, genuine sob, pressing a napkin to her face. Uncle Dave slammed his hand on the table in approval, cheering for my supposed generosity. Lauren shrieked a high-pitched sound of pure manufactured joy. She threw her arms around Seth, burying her face in his shoulder, while he looked around the room with a smug, victorious grin. Brenda stood near the kitchen, wiping a single perfect tear from her cheek, playing the role of the proud mother, witnessing a beautiful act of sibling devotion. I remained frozen in my chair. The clapping roared in my ears, a deafening wave of noise that drowned out any possibility of a rational thought. I stared at the key, resting in Lauren's palm. It was a standard brass Schlage key, bearing a distinct notch on the upper edge. My mind raced backward, tearing through the events of the evening. The guest bedroom, the pile of damp raincoats, my purse left unguarded while I was carrying appetizer platters to the lanai. My father had not just orchestrated a public robbery. He had physically rummaged through my personal belongings, unzipped the hidden compartment of my bag, and extracted the spare key I kept on my secondary ring. The psychological trap was flawlessly constructed. They understood that if they made this demand in private, I would refuse. I would defend my property with the cold, hard logic they despised. Isolation breeds resistance, but an audience enforces compliance. By declaring my surrender in front of 15 relatives from the mainland, they weaponized the social contract. They cornered me in the blinding spotlight of holiday cheer. This is the anatomy of a social ambush. If I stood up in that moment, if I shouted that my father was a liar and a thief, I would instantly become the villain. I would ruin Christmas. I would shatter the beautiful, heartwarming illusion my parents just gifted to the extended family. I would be framed as the unstable, cruel, selfish daughter who backed out of a generous promise and made a pregnant woman cry on Christmas Eve. The pressure in the room was crushing. Relatives were raising their glasses, toasting to my name. Voices merged into a chorus of praise for a sacrifice I never agreed to make. They had bypassed my consent, entirely substituting a public consensus in its place. In their minds, the transaction was finished. The deed to my $450,000 sanctuary, the home I bled for, was being treated like a passed-down sweater. Faces began turning toward me, smiling, expectant faces. Aunt Karen leaned across the table, her eyes wet with tears, whispering about how proud my grandmother would have been. Lauren rose from her chair, holding her belly, waddling around the table to deliver a theatrical embrace. I watched her approach. The trap was fully sprung. I was surrounded by witnesses locked inside a cage built entirely out of applause. Every instinct in my body screamed to fight to tear the key from her hand and walk out the front door. I felt the heat rising in my chest, the furious indignation of a woman having her future stolen in broad daylight. But as my sister leaned in for a hug, preparing to whisper her victory into my ear, a different survival instinct took over. I realized the only way out of a burning room is to walk quietly toward the exit. Lauren leaned in. The scent of her expensive floral perfume invaded my personal space. My brain processed the threat matrix in a fraction of a second. If I slapped the key out of her hand, my father would play the wounded peacemaker. My mother would weep about my lack of empathy. My aunts and uncles would view me as a monster hoarding wealth from an unborn child. They wanted a spectacle. A spectacle provides cover for theft. So I did the most terrifying thing a targeted person can do. I smiled. I forced the muscles in my cheeks upward, crafting a warm, bright expression of sisterly devotion. I wrapped my arms around Lauren's shoulders and squeezed. She let out a muffled sob of gratitude against my collarbone, whispering how she knew I would come through for her. I patted her back in a soothing rhythm. Then I pulled away, kept the bright smile fixed on my face, and began to clap. I applauded my own financial ruin. The room let out a collective breath. The ambient tension dissolved into pure, unfiltered relief. Tom's shoulders dropped an inch. He had won. Brenda beamed, raising her wine glass toward me in a silent toast to her successful campaign. The extended relatives joined my applause, a chorus of validation validating a crime. While my hands met in a steady, rhythmic clap, my mind detached from the dining room. I retreated into the quiet, analytical space where I solve complex network failures. I looked at the brass key in Lauren's hand and thought about what it actually represented. They viewed that key as a piece of metal granting access to drywall and hardwood floors. They did not see the currency I used to purchase it. That condo was not bought with mere dollars. It was bought with my 20s. It was purchased with the fluorescent glare of server rooms at 2 in the morning while my peers were dancing at downtown clubs. I secured that down payment by volunteering for every grueling holiday shift migrating databases on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Eve, while my family gathered around tables just like this one without me. I remembered the physical ache behind my eyes after staring at thousands of lines of code, hunting for a single security flaw. I remembered the distinct hollow feeling of declining invitations to destination weddings and weekend getaways because every spare cent was being funneled into a high-yield savings account. I traded a decade of my youth for a permanent address. Now my father was handing those 10 years to a man who quit his last startup because he did not like waking up before 9 in the morning. Smiling under these conditions requires a specific kind of dissociation. You separate the physical body from the internal self. You nod when spoken to. You show your teeth. You deny the manipulator the friction they need to ignite their drama. Narcissists thrive on your visible pain. Your anger proves they have power over you. Your outrage feeds their victim narrative. By projecting serene acceptance, I starved them. Aunt Karen walked around the table and grabbed both of my hands, her rings digging into my knuckles. She told me I was an angel on earth, that I possessed a rare and generous spirit. I thanked her, keeping my voice soft and humble. Uncle Dave slapped me on the back, offering a booming compliment about how I always was the sensible one. I agreed with him. I agreed with everyone. Seth approached next. He did not offer a genuine thank you. He offered a tight, patronizing grin, the look of a man who just inherited a fortune without lifting a finger. He extended a hand and pulled me into a brief, awkward embrace, smelling of scotch and unearned victory. He told me I was a lifesaver, promising they would have me over for dinner once they got the place painted and properly decorated. I told him I looked forward to it. I watched him envision himself standing on my balcony, claiming the ocean view as his own. He was already measuring my living room in his mind. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal blur. I sat back down and ate a slice of pecan pie. I drank a glass of ice water. I listened to my relatives debate baby names and discuss neighborhood school districts for my sister's children. I participated in the conversation, offering mild suggestions and polite laughter. I functioned as a ghost haunting my own funeral, watching my family divide my estate while I was still drawing breath. I knew they were waiting for the facade to crack. Brenda cast lingering, suspicious glances in my direction every few minutes. She knew me well enough to recognize that a sudden, frictionless surrender was out of character. She expected me to pull her aside into the kitchen for a whispered, furious confrontation. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I remained seated in the living room, a monument to cooperative sibling harmony. As the clock neared 10, I stood up and smoothed the front of my linen dress. I announced that I had an early morning maintenance window for a hospital server upgrade and needed to head home to catch a few hours of sleep. The excuse was a lie, but it sounded boring and responsible, precisely the kind of tedious detail they expected from me. The farewells were extravagant. Brenda hugged me tight, kissing my cheek and whispering that I was a good daughter. Tom gave me a hearty pat on the shoulder, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a conqueror. Lauren waved from the sofa, the brass key resting on the coffee table in front of her like a trophy. I walked out the front door and stepped into the damp Hawaiian night. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and fragrant with wet soil and jasmine. I walked down the driveway toward my 10-year-old sedan parked on the street. I moved at a normal, unhurried pace. I did not storm off. I did not stomp my feet. I knew faces might be watching from the front window, monitoring my departure. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled the door shut. The heavy thud of this car door sealing me inside severed my connection to the house. The ambient noise of the crickets and the distant highway vanished. The cabin was dark and entirely silent. The smile dropped from my face instantly. It fell away like a discarded theatrical mask. The warm, sisterly glow vanished, replaced by a cold, rigid stillness. I sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to my own steady breathing. My hands rested on the steering wheel, perfectly still. They were not shaking. My pulse was not racing. The anger I expected to feel was absent. What filled the void was something far more dangerous. It was a surgical, ice-cold clarity. I did not want to yell at my father. I did not want to send a long, emotional text message to my mother explaining how deeply they had wounded me. Emotional appeals are drafted by people who still hope to be understood. I had abandoned that hope hours ago inside the dining room. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life, casting the pale glow of the dashboard across my face. I shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving my family celebrating their stolen prize. I was not planning an argument. I was not preparing a legal defense to keep my home. I was drafting a blueprint for evaporation. They wanted my real estate, but they had forgotten one fundamental detail about the asset they tried to claim. The deed was exclusively in my name, and the market was open. December 26th dawned with a brilliant and blinding sunrise over Diamond Head Crater. I stood in my kitchen holding a cup of black tea and watching the early morning surfers carve through the Pacific swells. The interior of my home was quiet. The only sound was the gentle mechanical hum of the refrigerator. The chaotic spectacle of the previous night felt like a distant nightmare, but the reality of my family's agenda remained very present. I took a slow breath of the salt air drifting through the open window. Then the digital intrusion began. My phone screen illuminated on the quartz counter. It vibrated against the stone, a harsh rattling noise that shattered the morning peace. I walked over and looked at the display. The name Lauren appeared at the top. I unlocked the device, expecting perhaps a shallow message of fake gratitude or a hollow apology for the public spectacle. I underestimated her completely. Lauren did not send a thank you, she sent an itinerary. The message was a detailed and formatted list of demands for her new residence. The sheer audacity of the text radiated from the screen. She informed me that the current color of the living room walls was too cool and modern for a growing family. She requested that I repaint the entire main living space a specific shade of warm beige before my departure. She even included the exact brand and paint code, noting that the fumes needed time to dissipate before her toddler could safely enter the environment. The demands continued downward. She explicitly instructed me to leave behind my high-end front-loading washer and dryer units. These appliances cost me $3,000 6 months ago. Lauren justified this demand by explaining that Seth absolutely despised laundromats. According to her, public washing machines ruined his premium activewear, and a man under his level of entrepreneurial stress simply could not be expected to sit in a public facility folding clothes. Finally, she casually suggested I hire a professional deep cleaning crew to scrub the baseboards and sanitize the grout, emphasizing that a pregnant woman must avoid exposure to lingering household dust. I read the text message 3 times. I studied the words to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. The psychology of the golden child is a fascinating and terrifying mechanism. It was not enough to publicly commandeer a $450,000 piece of real estate. The thief was actively demanding that the victim polish the silver paint the walls and leave a mint on the pillow before handing over the stolen goods. A normal person would have felt a surge of explosive rage. They would have drafted a furious paragraph detailing the sheer insanity of the request. They would have ignited a digital war launching insults and demanding respect. But anger is an emotional investment. Anger implies that you still care about the relationship and want the other party to understand your perspective. I had zero interest in being understood. I only had an interest in being gone. I selected the emoji keyboard. I bypassed the faces and the symbols. I tapped a single simple image. A yellow thumbs up. I pressed send. That single digital gesture locked the trap firmly into place. Lauren would interpret the thumbs up as total submission. It would reinforce her delusion that I was a passive, agreeable servant, perfectly willing to accommodate her domestic fantasies. She would spend her day browsing furniture catalogs and picking out nursery curtains, entirely convinced that her future was secure. I closed the messaging application and opened my contact list. I scrolled past my relatives and colleagues until I found the number for David. I met David 2 years ago at a commercial networking event in downtown Honolulu. He was a ruthless, highly efficient property investor. He did not wear flashy suits or drive luxury vehicles. He wore plain golf shirts and drove a dusty pickup truck. David operated a wholesale real estate syndicate backed by private lenders. He made his living preying on distressed assets, sudden divorces, and inherited homes that families wanted to liquidate quietly. He bypassed traditional banking entirely. There were no 30-day escrow periods. There were no lengthy appraisals or buyer contingencies. He dealt strictly in cash and speed. He usually offered 80 cents on the dollar, taking advantage of sellers who prioritized a fast exit over maximum profit. Right now, speed was the exact commodity I required. I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice gruff and devoid of pleasantries. "David, this is Suri Alva. We met at the Pacific Club Mixer." He paused, shuffling papers on his end. "Suri, the IT director. I remember. What do you need?" "I need to liquidate a property," I told him, keeping my tone strictly professional. "It is an off-market unit. 15th floor in Waikiki. 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, panoramic ocean views. The title is clear. There are no encumbrances, no liens, and nobody else on the deed. I need a cash offer and I need a 3-day close." The line went quiet for a moment. In the real estate world, a 3-day close is an aggressive timeline bordering on impossible for anyone relying on standard financial institutions. But David was not a standard institution. He was a shark smelling blood in the water. "Are you in distress?" he asked. His tone was not empathetic. He was simply calculating his leverage. "No financial distress," I replied smoothly. "I am making a sudden career transition and relocating to the mainland. I want to leave without loose ends. I understand this requires a discount on the market value. I am willing to absorb that margin in exchange for absolute discretion and immediate execution." I heard the sound of a keyboard clicking as he quickly pulled up the public tax records for my building. The mechanics of a cash buyer network rely on hard data. He verified my ownership status and the square footage while we spoke. The transaction was a beautifully cold contrast to the suffocating emotional theater of my family. My parents operated on guilt, shame, and twisted cultural loyalty. David operated on math. He gave me a preliminary number. It was lower than the market rate, but it was still a life-changing sum of liquid capital. It was more than enough to start over anywhere in the country. I agreed to the ballpark figure without hesitation. "I need to walk the unit before I wire the earnest money," David stated. "I can be there in 2 hours." I gave him the address and the gate code. We ended the call. I walked over to the closet in my master bedroom and pulled out a heavy fireproof safe hidden beneath a stack of winter blankets. I entered the combination and opened the heavy steel door. Inside were my passports, my birth certificate, and the original deed to the condominium. I ran my fingers over the raised seal on the official document. My name and only my name was printed across the heavy paper. My parents had convinced themselves they owned my life, but the state of Hawaii only recognized the ink on this page. My phone vibrated again on the bedspread. It was a text message from Brenda. The message bubbled with artificial sweetness. She told me how incredibly proud she was of my sacrifice and promised that the ancestors were smiling down on my display of genuine ohana. She added a long string of heart emojis. I stared at the glowing screen while holding the physical deed in my hand. The juxtaposition was staggering. Brenda was busy directing a fantasy play where she was the benevolent matriarch. She was texting me from a reality that did not exist. Meanwhile, I was actively dismantling the stage she was standing on. I did not reply to her message. I placed the deed on the kitchen counter, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and prepared for my meeting. I was not packing suitcases. I was not folding clothes into cardboard boxes. I was liquidating my entire existence right out from under them, and they were completely blind to the machinery currently locking them out of their prize. I required a legal professional who operated at the same velocity as David. I found her in a sterile, air-conditioned office in downtown Honolulu. Her name was Diane. She was a veteran real estate attorney who did not care about emotional baggage, holiday miracles, or sisterly obligations. She only cared about clear titles and billable hours. I sat across from her heavy mahogany desk early Monday morning, handing over a manila folder containing the granular details of my life. Diane adjusted her reading glasses and opened the file. She scrutinized the documents with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon inspecting an X-ray. She pulled out the original mortgage agreement, the closing disclosures, and the deed to the property. I watched her eyes scan the pages, waiting for a hidden encumbrance to suddenly appear. There were none. I leaned back in the leather guest chair and felt a profound sense of validation wash over me. The paperwork was immaculate. I reviewed those documents a dozen times before walking into her office, but seeing a legal expert confirm my reality provided a distinct grounding comfort. Brenda and Tom never co-signed the loan. They never contributed a single dollar to the down payment. They did not serve as guarantors. The deed was solely in the name of Suri Alva. Diane set the papers down and looked at me. The title is clear, she stated. You hold exclusive ownership. Transferring this to a corporate entity in a cash transaction can be executed within 3 days provided the buyer has the liquid funds ready to wire. I will draft the transfer authorization and the purchase agreement by this afternoon. I thanked her and paid the retainer fee. Walking out of the high-rise building and stepping onto the sunlit pavement, I thought about the staggering cognitive dissonance operating inside my family. How does a group of adults convince themselves they possess the authority to give away real estate they never purchased? It requires a specific breed of shared delusion. In my family, the boundaries between individual achievement and collective property were erased whenever it benefited my parents. They blurred the lines through a slow, steady drip of entitlement. When I secured my promotion to IT manager, they treated my increased salary as an expanded family emergency fund. When I closed on this condominium 5 years ago, Tom purchased a stainless steel refrigerator for the kitchen. He called it a housewarming gift. In his mind, handing a delivery driver a retail credit card forged a permanent equity stake in the property. A kitchen appliance somehow bought him the right to act as a landlord. They repeated the fiction of their own authority for so long that the narrative hardened into perceived fact. They built a grand benevolent illusion where they were the generous providers, bestowing gifts upon their children. They actually forgot that the legal system operates on ink and notarized signatures, not on holiday speeches and stolen spare keys. While Diane sharpened the legal guillotine, my phone provided a constant buzzing reminder of the alternate reality my parents inhabited. The texts from Brenda arrived in predictable intervals throughout the day. I sat at a corner table in a quiet cafe, sipping green tea and reviewing the digital drafts Diane emailed to me while my mother sent paragraphs about the beauty of sacrifice. She texted me a photograph of Lauren looking at nursery paint swatches. The caption read, "Look at the joy you are bringing to this family. The ancestors are smiling down on your Ohana spirit today." I toggled between the messaging application and the legal portal. On one screen, I read a legally binding contract that would permanently strip my family of their prize. On the other screen, I received heart emojis from a woman decorating a house of cards. The discipline required to maintain this facade was immense. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard. A familiar, deeply ingrained instinct urged me to argue, to type out the truth, to shatter her smug satisfaction. The urge to defend myself was a ghost of the girl I used to be, the daughter who still believed she could reason with unreasonable people. I pushed that ghost away. I drew upon the same clinical focus I use when securing a compromised network. You do not negotiate with a virus. You isolate it, and you shut the system down. I replied to Brenda with a simple smiley face. An hour later, Lauren sent a message asking if the building allowed contractors to work on weekends, noting that Seth wanted to rip out the bathroom vanity immediately. I told her I would check with the property management office and get back to her. I played the role of the defeated compliance servant flawlessly. My quiet, methodical movements became the ultimate form of self-defense. I fed their delusion precisely what it needed to grow. I gave them no resistance to push against. I allowed them to float higher and higher on their balloon of entitlement, knowing that the atmosphere was about to thin out. There is a dark, profound satisfaction in holding a secret that will devastate your abusers. The knowledge insulated me from their daily insults. When my father texted me a reminder to start packing my books into smaller boxes so I would not scratch the hallway floors during my exit, I did not feel humiliated. I felt a surge of cold anticipation. I agreed to use bubble wrap knowing he would soon be standing in that same hallway talking to a corporate property manager who held the real keys. By Tuesday afternoon, the legal architecture was fully established. Diane sent the finalized purchase agreement to my secure email server. The title search came back flawless. The contract stripped away every contingency, waiving inspections and appraisals in exchange for a rapid close. The trap was engineered to perfection on paper. But real estate transactions require physical validation. A buyer cannot wire hundreds of thousands of dollars without laying eyes on the asset. David needed to walk the floors, inspect the plumbing, and verify the condition of the unit before he authorized his bank to release the funds. We scheduled the walkthrough for Wednesday morning. David agreed to pose as an IT equipment appraiser, a cover story we formulated just in case a neighbor asked questions. The timing was crucial. Brenda attended her neighborhood association board meeting on Wednesday mornings, ensuring she would be occupied and away from her phone. Lauren usually slept until noon. The perimeter was supposed to be clear. I spent Tuesday evening organizing my home to look presentable for the investor, making sure the ocean views were unobstructed and the structural integrity was obvious. I was wiping down the kitchen island when my phone lit up with a new notification. It was a text from Tom. "I am dropping by tomorrow morning around 10. The message read, "Seth wants to know the exact dimensions of the living room wall for his new television mount. I have my key, so do not worry if you are in a meeting. I will let myself in." I stared at the glowing screen. The air in the kitchen grew stale. My father was planning to enter my home using the stolen key at the exact hour David was scheduled to inspect the property. The careful, silent architecture I built was suddenly on a collision course with my father's arrogance. If Tom walked through that door and found a ruthless real estate investor assessing the property value, the entire operation would detonate prematurely. The conflict shifted from a digital chess match to a physical standoff. I had 12 hours to figure out how to sneak a cash buyer into my home while my father held a key to the front door. I stared at the glowing screen, reading my father's message. He intended to walk through my front door using the purloined key at the exact moment my cash buyer was scheduled to inspect the asset. Panic is a useless emotion during a network breach. You do not panic. You build a firewall. I picked up my device and typed a swift, authoritative reply. I informed him that I had a high-level HIPAA compliance audit occurring at 10 in the morning. An external vendor was conducting a physical hardware inspection. The building required strict clearance for non-residents during the review to protect sensitive medical data. I told him he could arrive at noon instead. I sent the text and waited. My father spent his career as a branch manager at a retail bank. He understood the unyielding nature of corporate compliance and the rigid boundaries of third-party auditors. A minute later, a short response arrived, confirming he would delay his visit until noon. The collision was averted. I secured a 2-hour operational window to sell my home. David arrived at precisely 9:45. He bypassed the front desk by wearing a polo shirt with a generic tech logo and carrying a thick clipboard, flawlessly executing our agreed-upon cover story. I opened the door and ushered him inside. He did not waste time exchanging pleasantries. He possessed the clinical detachment of a man who evaluates concrete and steel devoid of any sentimental attachment to the ocean view. He walked the perimeter of the condominium, running his hands along the window seals to check for moisture intrusion. He flushed both toilets, tested the water pressure in the showers, and inspected the breaker panel in the hallway closet. His eyes scanned the baseboards and the ceiling joints looking for foundation settling or hidden water damage. I watched him work, admiring his ruthless efficiency. David did not care about the memories housed within these walls. He was not interested in nursery themes or the perfect shade of warm beige paint. He only cared about the margin of profit and the structural integrity of his investment. After 15 minutes of silent assessment, David returned to the kitchen. He placed his clipboard on the quartz island. "The unit is pristine," he stated, his voice flat and businesslike. You maintain the property exceptionally well. The climate control system is current, and the flooring requires 0 updates. Based on the market comparables and the expedited timeline, you require my group can offer $420,000. We can close the transaction and initiate the wire transfer in 3 days, right before the December 31st deadline. We cover all closing costs. You walk away clean. The figure represented a $30,000 haircut from the recent appraisal. In a traditional real estate environment, a seller might negotiate or balk at the reduction. But traditional transactions involve 30 days of escrow-nosy real estate agents and endless contingencies that would afford my family ample time to discover the sale and sabotage the process. I was not paying for a fair market valuation. I was paying for speed certainty and an ironclad veil of secrecy. The discount was merely the price of my unhindered freedom. I accept the terms, I replied without hesitation. David retrieved a stack of dense legal paperwork from his briefcase. It was the preliminary purchase agreement drafted by my attorney waiting for wet ink to bind the terms. He laid the pages flat on the kitchen island and handed me a heavy blue ink pen. Just as the metal tip touched the paper, my cell phone chimed from the adjacent counter. The notification sound broke the quiet tension of the room. It was a social media alert. I glanced over and saw Lauren's name flash across the screen. She had just published a public update on Facebook tagging a dozen extended relatives and her husband, Seth. I unlocked the screen and opened the application. The post featured a professionally filtered photograph of Lauren and Seth standing on a beach, cradling her pregnant stomach against a backdrop of a setting sun and crashing waves. The caption below the image was a masterpiece of entitled delusion. Feeling incredibly blessed today as we prepare to welcome our newest addition, Lauren wrote. God truly works in mysterious ways. We are overjoyed to announce our new home blessing. We will be moving into a beautiful, spacious Waikiki sanctuary just in time for the new year. Thank you to my amazing family for understanding the true spirit of Ohana, manifesting peace, love, and nursery designs. We cannot wait to host our first dinner party with ocean views. Beneath the paragraph, the digital applause was already pouring in. Aunt Karen commented with a string of praying hands. Uncle Dave typed a congratulatory message about Seth finally getting the space he needed to grow his visionary ideas. Dozens of likes and heart icons cascaded down the feed, celebrating a victory they believed was etched in stone. They were digitally toasting to a future constructed entirely out of stolen property. I looked away from the glowing screen and focused my attention back on the legal document resting on the granite counter. The juxtaposition was intoxicating. On the digital network, my sister was claiming a kingdom. In the physical world, I was dismantling the castle brick by brick. I gripped the pen and signed my full legal name on the buyer agreement line. I initialed the specific clauses, waiving the inspection period and confirming the accelerated closing date. I pressed firmly, ensuring the blue ink soaked into the heavy paper, creating an irreversible legal bond. The contract is executed, David said, taking the paperwork and sliding it back into his briefcase. My team will initiate the title transfer protocols this afternoon. You need to provide your secure routing information for the disbursement. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket, containing the account numbers for a new, isolated financial institution I established the previous day. This account was entirely disconnected from the local credit union my parents used. I selected a bank with no branches in Hawaii to ensure my funds would drop into an invisible vault. I handed the routing details to David. He gave a curt nod. We close on December 31st. You have until midnight on the 30th to vacate the premises. He turned and walked out the front door, slipping back into the hallway, a ghost executing a corporate acquisition. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the soft click of the lock securing the entrance. I picked up my phone again. Lauren's post had accumulated 50 more likes. My mother had just shared the update to her own timeline, adding a caption about how proud she was of her generous daughters. They were proudly celebrating a finish line they had already failed to cross. They were entirely blind to the financial machinery closing in around them, oblivious to the fact that the keys in their pockets were rapidly becoming useless pieces of brass. The legal trap was primed and set. The sale was a binding reality. But executing a covert property transfer presented an entirely new logistical nightmare. I had 72 hours to empty my life from a 2-bedroom condominium, pack my valuable electronics, and vanish without leaving a single visible trace. I needed to extract my existence while maintaining the illusion that the home was simply waiting for its new occupants, knowing my father was scheduled to walk through my front door in exactly 45 minutes. The 45-minute countdown felt like a tightening vice. I moved through my kitchen with frantic purpose, hiding the signed purchase agreement and banking documents deep inside a locked filing cabinet. At exactly noon, the heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded. I took a deep breath, smoothed the front of my shirt, and pulled the door open. My father stood in the hallway. He held a bright yellow tape measure and a thick clipboard. He wore the relaxed, confident expression of a patriarch preparing to inspect his newly conquered territory. He took a step forward, intending to breeze past me into the living room. I shifted my weight, planting my feet firmly in the center of the threshold. I kept the door cracked just enough to facilitate a conversation, but narrow enough to block his line of sight. Behind me, 3 empty cardboard boxes sat conspicuously on the dining table. I asked him what he needed, keeping my tone light and inquisitive. He explained that Seth required exact wall dimensions to order a custom articulating mount for an 85-inch television. He leaned to the side, trying to peer around my shoulder to get a look at the space. I mirrored his movement, stepping sideways to intercept his gaze. I deployed the technical excuse we had agreed upon via text message. I explained that the external compliance auditors were actively running diagnostic sweeps on my local network. I told him the environment had to remain physically secure to prevent any liability regarding sensitive patient data. I reached into my pocket and handed him a folded piece of paper. I told him I had already measured the living room walls for him to save time. He looked at the paper, then back at me, his brow furrowing in slight annoyance at being denied entry. He asked why the place looked a bit messy through the crack in the door. I offered a warm, sisterly smile. I told him I was just decluttering for the transition, throwing away old paperwork to ensure the space was clean and ready for Lauren and the new baby. The lie functioned perfectly. My father accepted the paper and praised my proactive attitude. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that my proactive nature was currently dismantling his entire scheme. He turned and walked down the carpeted hallway toward the elevator. I gently closed the door and slid the deadbolt into place. My pulse hammered against my ribs. The adrenaline flooded my system, leaving a metallic taste in my mouth. The collision was averted, but the encounter highlighted the extreme fragility of my situation. I could not risk another daytime visit. The extraction had to happen in the shadows. The covert operation began that night. Between 1 and 4 in the morning, the high-rise building descended into a deep, predictable slumber. The corridors emptied. The concierge desk operated on a skeleton crew, and the security guards rotated through remote patrols, leaving the freight elevator unwatched. I functioned with the silent precision of a phantom. I started with the items that held the most value and the least bulk. I packed my high-end server arrays, my dual monitors, and the intricate networking gear that powered my career. I wrapped fragile hard drives in thick sweaters and loaded them into dark canvas duffel bags to avoid drawing any visual attention. I carried the heavy bags down the freight elevator, slipping into the damp, dimly lit underground parking garage. The tropical night air clung to my skin, thick with humidity and the faint scent of ocean salt. My muscles ached from the physical exertion and the relentless lack of sleep. I drove back and forth across the island, transporting my life to a climate-controlled storage unit I had rented under a newly formed corporate name. The physical toll was exhausting, dragging heavy equipment through the quiet city streets while the rest of the world slept. But the emotional weight proved far more taxing than the physical labor. Packing up a home under the cover of darkness feels inherently wrong, even when you are the rightful owner protecting your own assets. I stood in the center of my bedroom during the second night of the move. I looked at the ocean view I had paid for with years of my youth. A sudden, profound wave of sorrow threatened to overtake me. I was dismantling my sanctuary because the people who were supposed to protect me had chosen to exploit me. They had forced me to become a fugitive inside my own life. The unfairness of the situation burned in my chest. I did not let the sorrow paralyze me. I weaponized the grief. Every pang of sadness fueled my forward momentum. Every memory of their condescending remarks, every echo of my mother calling my career a hobby, gave me the energy to tape another box shut. The pain transformed into a cold, driving fuel. I stripped the walls of personal artwork. I cleared the bathroom cabinets of my expensive toiletries. I packed my jewelry, my vital records, and my professional wardrobe. Yet I meticulously curated what stayed behind. I left the bulky sectional sofa in the center of the living room. I left the heavy oak dining table and the matching chairs. I kept the cheap guest bed frame exactly where it had always been. Leaving the large, inexpensive furniture served a crucial dual purpose. It saved me the logistical nightmare of hiring a commercial moving truck, which would have instantly alerted the building management and my family. More importantly, it maintained a flawless optical illusion. If my parents or my sister somehow managed to peek through the front windows, or if they questioned a nosy neighbor, the condominium would look entirely undisturbed. The silhouette of the couch and the table would signal that the home was simply waiting for its new occupants. It looked like a generous gift sitting quietly in Waikiki. It was a carefully constructed stage set designed to keep the actors pacified while the director quietly exited the theater. I left a bottle of cheap hand soap by the sink and a single towel hanging on the rack to keep the illusion pristine. By the time the sun began to rise on the morning of December 30th, my entire personal existence had been erased from the 15th floor. The closets were empty, the drawers were bare, the servers were gone. The only things remaining were the heavy wooden props holding up the facade. I stood in the doorway wearing my last clean outfit, holding a small overnight bag. I looked around the hollow space. It no longer felt like my sanctuary. It felt like a trap I had successfully navigated. I locked the front door for the final time, stepping into the hallway. The physical extraction was complete. Now I just had to survive the final 24 hours until the bank wired the funds and the title officially transferred, severing my ties to this island forever. December 31st brought the kind of heavy, stifling humidity that makes the horizon shimmer and bends the light over the asphalt. Inside Diane's downtown law office, the climate control ran at a steady 68 degrees. I sat in a high-backed leather chair across from her polished mahogany desk. The room smelled of ozone fresh paper and expensive coffee. David sat to my right, tapping a silver pen against his knee. He wore another generic golf shirt, projecting the casual demeanor of a man who moved six-figure sums before lunch. The contrast between the tropical heat outside and the sterile chill of the legal environment felt appropriate. My family thrived in the heat, the noise, the emotional humidity of shared guilt. I was currently operating in the cold, clinical realm of contractual law. I picked up the pen Diane offered. My hand hovered over the signature line of the closing disclosure. Signing away a home is supposed to be a momentous, tearful occasion. People usually pop champagne or take photographs holding a sold sign. I felt nothing but a singular driving focus. I traced my name across the bottom of the page. The friction of the ballpoint pen against the thick parchment sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I initialed the margins binding the title transfer, severing my legal ties to the coordinates on the 15th floor. The paperwork was pushed to the center of the desk. Diane inspected the signatures, cross-referencing them with my state-issued identification. She gave a curt nod and turned her attention to her dual monitors. She initiated the escrow release protocol. David pulled out his phone and authorized the wire transfer from his syndicate account. The digital machinery engaged. I opened my banking application on my device. The screen displayed my newly created isolated account. The balance sat at 0. The silence in the room stretched out, measured only by the ticking of a modern wall clock. It was 2 o'clock, then 2:10. The banking system routes funds through a series of automated clearinghouses, a process that can take minutes or hours. I watched the screen, seeing my breath fog the glass slightly. At 2:14 in the afternoon, the application interface refreshed. A green loading circle spun for a fraction of a second. Then the screen populated with a new digit, $420,000. The numbers sat there glowing against the white background. The script of my life slowed down to capture the profound, silent weight of this moment. That figure was not merely a monetary value. It was crystallized freedom. It was the physical manifestation of my restored youth, my stolen holidays, and my endless overtime shifts. It represented the boundary they could never breach. In my mother's mind, I was a selfish daughter hoarding empty bedrooms. On the screen in front of me, I was an independent woman holding a fortress of liquid capital. I closed the application and slid the phone into my pocket. "The transaction is complete," Diane stated, stamping a final seal onto the folder. "The title is officially transferred to the corporate entity. You are clear." I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy metal ring holding the physical keys to the condominium. Not the spare brass copy my father stole from my purse, but the master set. I handed them across the desk to David. He took them, his expression unchanged. He did not offer congratulations. He just nodded, stood up, and walked out of the office to secure his new investment. I thanked Diane for her efficiency. I took the elevator down to the street level, stepping out into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat hit my skin, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt like walking out of a cage. I caught a rideshare to the Daniel K. Inouye International Airport. As the car navigated the congested highway traffic, I watched the familiar palm trees and strip malls blur past the window. My family believed my entire existence was anchored to this island. They thought my career was a tether they could exploit. They underestimated my professional network. 3 weeks ago, while they were busy plotting their Christmas ambush, I sat in my home office conducting rigorous video interviews with a technology firm based in the Pacific Northwest. I pitched a comprehensive restructuring plan for their data security architecture. They did not view my skills as fiddling with routers. They recognized my expertise. They offered me an information technology director role, complete with a substantial compensation package and immediate relocation assistance. I accepted the position in silence. Seattle offered gray skies, freezing rain, and a culture that prized polite distance over suffocating proximity. It was the exact opposite of the environment I was leaving behind. It was a fresh, blank canvas. I navigated the security checkpoints and walked toward my departure gate. The terminal hummed with tourists returning to the mainland, their faces sunburned, carrying plastic bags full of macadamia nuts. I carried a single backpack and a boarding pass. I found my seat near the window of the aircraft. The engine spooled up a low, powerful vibration that resonated through the floorboards. The plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway. As we lifted off the tarmac, climbing over the deep blue expanse of the ocean, the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky turned a brilliant bruised purple, casting long shadows across the waves. I leaned my head against the plastic window, watching the island shrink into a distant, insignificant speck. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone. I opened the contact list. I found Brenda's name. I selected her profile and tapped the block caller option. I repeated the process for Tom. I found Lauren's number, the same number that sent me a list of entitled demands just days prior regarding neutral paint colors and high-end appliances. I blocked it. I blocked Seth. I isolated my communication channels, ensuring their digital reach ended at the edge of the Pacific. A common expectation in dysfunctional families is the dramatic exit. They expect a tearful letter left on the kitchen counter. They expect a final blazing argument where grievances are aired and blame is assigned. They crave that closure because it validates their importance in your life. It proves that even in your departure, they hold the power to extract an emotional toll. I did not leave a note on the quartz island. I did not send a final text message explaining my departure. Explanations are a currency reserved for people who demonstrate respect. When you explain yourself to a manipulator, you are handing them a script to edit. You are giving them words they can twist into a narrative of their own victimhood. I refuse to supply the ink for their fiction. Ghosts do not owe anyone a narrative. I switched my device to airplane mode and closed my eyes. The trap was armed, the paperwork was filed, the new locks were already being installed by David's property manager. In less than 24 hours, the sun would rise on a new year. My family would wake up, rent a moving truck, and drive straight toward a reality they could never have anticipated. I drifted to sleep, to the steady hum of the jet engines, flying toward the cold rain, leaving them to face the consequences of their own entitlement. The sun rose on the first day of the new year, casting a bright, unforgiving light across the island of Oahu. While I sat thousands of miles away in a different time zone, my family initiated the final act of their own destruction. The morning carried the sluggish, quiet energy typical of a holiday, with the streets of Waikiki mostly devoid of traffic. My parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law formed a small convoy moving through the city. Seth drove a heavy yellow rental truck, its engine rumbling loudly as he navigated the narrow avenues. Lauren rode in the passenger seat, holding her smartphone, actively curating her social media presence for the moving day documentation. Tom and Brenda followed closely behind in their luxury sedan, basking in the warm glow of their manufactured generosity. They were a family arriving to claim their kingdom. They parked the massive rental truck illegally in the loading zone of my former building, demonstrating their usual disregard for the rules that governed everyone else. Tom bypassed the front desk concierge by slipping through the side security gate behind a resident walking a dog. He held the door for the rest of the group, ushering them into the lobby with the swagger of a man who owned the entire tower. They rode the elevator to the 15th floor in a state of giddy anticipation. Lauren held the shiny brass key in her palm, the red holiday ribbon still tied through the metal loop. She posed for a photograph in front of the elevator mirrors, framing the key near her pregnant stomach, solidifying the narrative of a mother entering her new sanctuary. They walked down the quiet carpeted hallway. The corridor smelled faintly of lemon floor wax and expensive air fresheners. They arrived at the heavy wooden door of my former unit. Lauren stepped forward, taking her position at the center of the threshold. Seth raised his phone to record a video of the milestone moment. Brenda clasped her hands together in delight. Tom stood with his arms crossed over his chest, projecting the image of a proud, providing patriarch. Lauren slid the brass key into the deadbolt cylinder. She pushed the metal forward and attempted to turn her wrist. The key refused to rotate. The internal pins did not align. The mechanism remained entirely rigid. She frowned, jiggling the brass handle. She pulled the key out halfway and shoved it back in, applying more force. The lock did not yield. The soft click she expected never materialized. A brief wave of confusion settled over the group. Seth lowered his recording device, letting out a heavy, patronizing sigh. He stepped forward, nudging his wife aside, assuming the failure was merely a product of her mechanical incompetence. He gripped the key tightly and twisted his wrist with sudden force. The brass scraped against the steel faceplate, biting into the skin of his palm, but the door remained sealed. Tom moved toward the door, his face flushing with the early signs of irritation. He muttered that I must have engaged the secondary internal security latch before I left. He raised his fist and knocked loudly on the wood, demanding that I open the door immediately. He called my name down the silent corridor, his voice echoing against the walls, shifting the mood from celebration to annoyance. Then a metallic click echoed from the other side of the wood. The deadbolt retracted. The heavy door swung inward. The family prepared their scolding remarks, ready to reprimand my delay and complain about their inconvenience. The words died in their throats. The person standing in the doorway was not a compliant daughter waiting to serve them. He was a man standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, possessing the broad, muscular shoulders of a former collegiate athlete. He wore a dark gray polo shirt bearing a corporate crest on the left breast. He held a digital tablet in one hand and a thick clipboard in the other. He surveyed the group standing in the hallway with the detached, unimpressed gaze of a professional who evicted problem tenants for a living. He was the regional asset manager for David and his investment syndicate. Brenda recoiled physically, stepping back from the threshold. Tom demanded to know who the stranger was and what he was doing inside his daughter's condominium. Lauren peered around the man's broad frame, trying to look into the unit. She searched for the familiar staging furniture, the dining table, the cozy atmosphere she had bragged about online. The living room was entirely bare. The staging props I left behind had been hauled away by the cleanup crew the previous evening. The space was a hollow echo chamber of beige carpet and white drywall devoid of any warmth or life. The asset manager did not flinch. He did not offer a friendly greeting. He identified himself representing Pacific Horizon Holdings. He informed the group that they were loitering in a private residential corridor without authorization. Tom squared his shoulders. He puffed his chest, attempting to inflate his authority to match the size of the man blocking the door. He shouted that he was the father of the owner and that the property had been gifted to his pregnant daughter for Christmas. He pointed an accusatory finger at the brass key in Seth's hand, presenting it as tangible proof of their ownership right. The manager looked at the key with mild disdain. He shifted his gaze back to Tom, his expression hardening into a mask of professional apathy. He stated with glacial clarity that the property was acquired in a cash transaction the previous afternoon. He explained that the locks were changed by a commercial locksmith at 7 in the morning. He calmly noted that holding a decorative piece of brass did not constitute a legal deed of transfer. The reality of the situation collided with their delusion. Lauren shrieked. The sound was shrill, frantic, and entirely unhinged. She demanded her nursery. She screamed that she was carrying a child and could not be subjected to this kind of emotional abuse. She threw her hands in the air, staging a full theatrical breakdown in the middle of the hallway. Seth attempted to physically bypass the manager, stepping aggressively toward the threshold to inspect the empty rooms. The manager did not retreat. He shifted his stance, occupying the center of the doorway, transforming into an immovable physical barrier defending a corporate investment. The ensuing commotion shattered the morning peace of the luxury high-rise. Doors along the 15th floor corridor began to crack open. The affluent residents of the building stepped out of their units to observe the disruption. These were people who paid steep association fees to guarantee a quiet, serene environment. Now they were standing in their silk robes watching a family scream at a doorway over a stolen house. Brenda noticed the audience forming around them. Her carefully curated social facade began to disintegrate in broad daylight. She whispered furiously to Tom, tugging at his shirt sleeve, desperately trying to contain the damage and salvage her dignity. But the momentum of their public humiliation was uncontrollable. The asset manager raised his digital tablet. He tapped the screen calmly, advising the group that attempting to breach the threshold constituted breaking and entering. He announced that he was currently dialing local law enforcement to report a trespassing incident in progress. He began dictating their physical descriptions into the phone while keeping his eyes locked firmly on Seth. The threat of police intervention broke the spell of their arrogance. The stark reality of arriving squad cars and potential handcuffs pierced through Tom's bluster. Seth stepped backward, his aggressive bravado collapsing instantly into cowardice. Brenda grabbed Lauren by the arm, physically pulling the weeping woman away from the doorframe. Tom issued a series of hollow, sputtering threats about contacting his attorneys, but he was already retreating down the hallway. The walk back to the elevator was a grueling gauntlet of public shame. The neighbors stared openly, their expressions ranging from amusement to sheer disgust. The elevator doors opened, and the family crowded inside, descending to the ground floor in a suffocating, silent plunge. They exited the lobby and stood on the hot sidewalk next to the rented moving truck. The massive yellow vehicle sat idle in the loading zone, transforming from a chariot of victory into an expensive monument to their failure. The tropical sun beat down on the pavement. The street traffic hummed past them. The realization finally settled over the group. The Christmas miracle was a phantom. They possessed no property. They held a useless key. They were racking up an hourly rental fee on a commercial truck filled with boxes they had nowhere to unload. The gift was a mirage, and they had driven their entitlement right into a brick wall. The shock mutated rapidly into frantic desperation. Tom pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his thumb hammering the screen. Brenda dug through her purse for her device. Seth paced the sidewalk, dialing numbers with frantic energy. The screens glowed in the midday sun. They initiated a relentless digital barrage, desperately seeking the ghost who orchestrated their ruin, paving the way for the storm of notifications waiting for me across the ocean. The Pacific Northwest offered a stark, freezing contrast to the sweltering pavement of Waikiki. I sat at a corner table inside a quiet coffee shop in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle. Frost clung to the edges of the window panes. A light, powdery snow drifted down from a pale gray sky, blanketing the sidewalks and quieting the city noise. I wore a thick wool sweater, wrapping my hands around a ceramic mug of dark roast. The air smelled of roasted beans and pine needles. Thousands of miles away, my family was standing on a humid sidewalk next to a useless rental truck, sweating under the tropical sun. I was untouchable. For 48 hours, my digital perimeter remained entirely sealed. I enjoyed the pristine quiet of my self-imposed isolation, exploring my new city, touring my future office building, and securing the lease on a spacious loft apartment. My liquid capital sat safely in my isolated accounts. The time had come to survey the wreckage. I opened the settings menu on my smartphone. I navigated to the blocked contacts list. I tapped my finger against Tom, Brenda, Lauren, and Seth, lifting the digital quarantine. I set the device face up on the polished wooden table and waited. The phone did not merely ring, it erupted. The device vibrated across the grain of the wood, emitting a relentless, stuttering physical hum that threatened to shake the coffee cup out of my hand. Notifications flooded the screen in a cascading waterfall of digital panic. The operating system struggled to process the sheer volume of delayed data crashing into the receiver all at once. The screen lit up flashing red and green icons, a visual representation of their collective psychological collapse. I did not touch the screen right away. I let the machinery catch up. When the vibration finally ceased, the metrics of their desperation sat displayed in bright white numbers. 89 missed audio calls, 140 text messages, 32 unread voicemails. The barrage spanned the entire morning, charting their emotional descent with timestamps. I picked up the device and opened the messaging application. I scrolled to the very top to read the transcript of their unraveling, approaching the data with the clinical detachment of a network administrator reviewing an error log. The initial messages reflected sheer arrogant confusion. Lauren texted first at 8 in the morning. "Where are you? The key does not turn. Did you lock the top latch? Come down here and open this door right now." 15 minutes later, Seth attempted to assert his unearned authority. "Suri, stop playing games. I am turning the lock and it is stuck. We have a truck on an hourly rate. Fix this immediately." By 8:30, the confusion morphed into frantic alarm following their humiliating encounter with the asset manager. Tom sent a terse demand. "Suri, answer your phone. There is a man here claiming he owns the unit. Tell him to leave our property. You are causing a scene and embarrassing us in front of the building staff." At 9 in the morning, after the threat of law enforcement drove them back to the street, the tone shifted into unbridled fury. Brenda fired off a paragraph of capitalized letters. "Call me right now. We are humiliated. The neighbors are staring at us. How could you do this to your pregnant sister? We are family. You are a disgrace to this Ohana." By 9:30, the reality of their situation had fractured their arrogance, leaving only despair and blame. Lauren descended into hysteria, sending a dozen fragmented sentences in rapid succession. "Where is my nursery? What did you do? Seth is furious. We have nowhere to go, and we gave notice at our rental. You ruined my life. You stole my home." I read every single word. I absorbed their outrage, their shock, their desperate attempts to assert dominance from a sidewalk where they held zero leverage. I did not feel a single pang of guilt. I did not feel the customary urge to apologize, to soothe their anxiety, or to fix the disaster they engineered. The snow continued to fall outside the cafe window, drifting gently onto the quiet street. The peaceful winter scene outside mirrored the profound calm within my own chest. Their digital screaming was trapped behind a pane of glass, entirely incapable of reaching me. My family operated on the assumption that my compliance was a fixed renewable resource. They believed that if they applied enough pressure, generated enough noise, and invoked enough guilt, I would eventually cave. They were currently discovering that the resource was permanently depleted. The 89 missed calls were not attempts to communicate. They were frantic grabs at a control mechanism that had broken free from their grasp. I sat in the corner booth sipping my coffee, enjoying the profound silence of my own autonomy. My entire childhood had been defined by managing their moods. If Tom was irritated, I made myself scarce. If Brenda wanted to play the martyr, I played the grateful audience. If Lauren demanded the spotlight, I willingly stood in the shadows. I spent 32 years modulating my existence to ensure their comfort. Looking at the staggering volume of text messages, I realized the true depth of their entitlement. Even after a corporate property manager told them the unit was sold, even after facing the threat of police intervention, their first instinct was to blame me for their own attempted theft. They still believed they were the victims of a cruel prank rather than the perpetrators of a failed robbery. The screen went dark for a brief moment, saving battery power. Then the device lit up again, buzzing against the table with a renewed sense of urgency. Call number 90. The interface displayed an incoming group video transmission. Brenda initiated the connection. The contact names for Tom, Lauren, and Seth appeared underneath her profile picture. They had gathered together, pooling their collective outrage into a single unified strike. They expected my voicemail to intercept the attempt, just as it had done for the previous 89 calls. They assumed I was hiding, cowering in fear of their righteous indignation. They thought my silence was born of cowardice, a retreat from the consequences of my actions. I set my ceramic mug down on a cork coaster. I adjusted my posture, sitting up straight against the wooden back of the booth. I looked at the green accept button sliding across the bottom of the screen. A ghost does not negotiate, but a ghost can certainly haunt. I dragged my finger across the glass, the connection finalized. The video feed opened, displaying 4 frantic faces huddled around a single smartphone camera lens. They stood on a sun-baked Hawaiian street, squinting against the glare sweating through their clothes. The yellow rental truck loomed in the background behind Seth's shoulder. I did not offer a greeting. I did not ask how their moving day was progressing. I held the phone steady, keeping my face perfectly framed in the center of their screen. I maintained a neutral, unblinking stare, projecting the cold, steady climate of my new city straight into their humid chaos. I waited perfectly still and let them break the silence. The digital connection stabilized, resolving into a chaotic cluster of 4 familiar faces pressed close to the smartphone camera lens. Through the glowing rectangle, I watched the sweltering reality of the Hawaiian afternoon clash with the pristine chill of my Seattle winter. Tom held the device, his large hand trembling so severely the image stuttered. His face was a deep mottled crimson. Sweat beaded along his hairline, soaking into the collar of his expensive linen shirt. Behind him, the bright yellow side of the rental truck served as a mocking backdrop to their collective ruin. Lauren stood a few paces back, leaning heavily against the metal bumper. Her designer maternity dress clung to her damp skin. She was sobbing genuine, gasping cries that wrecked her carefully applied makeup. Brenda hovered just over my father's shoulder, her eyes wide and frantic, while Seth paced the sidewalk in tight, anxious circles, still clutching the useless brass key. They stared at me through the screen, waiting for the apology they believed was inevitable. They expected to see a frightened, remorseful daughter scrambling to explain a misunderstanding. Instead, they saw a woman sitting calmly in a quiet cafe, sipping a dark roast coffee, wearing a thick wool sweater they had never seen before. I offered no greeting. I let the visual of my relaxed posture inflict the first strike. Tom broke the silence, his voice cracking with unchecked fury. He did not ask what was happening. He issued a command operating under the delusion that his patriarchal authority extended across the Pacific Ocean. "Suri, you will pick up your phone right now and call the front desk," he ordered, thrusting his free hand toward the camera. "You will tell security to remove that lunatic from the hallway. We have a truck full of furniture sitting in a loading zone costing us by the hour. Stop this ridiculous stunt and fix this mistake immediately." He actually believed I possessed the power to evict an asset manager from a building I no longer owned. He thought the corporate representative upstairs was merely an actor I hired to play a cruel prank. His brain, conditioned by decades of unquestioned obedience, simply rejected the concept of my defiance. Lauren pushed her way into the camera frame, shoving Brenda aside. She pointed a trembling finger at the lens. "You are ruining my life!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the concrete buildings around them. "My nursery was supposed to be painted today. Seth gave notice at our apartment. We have nowhere to live. Call that man off right now. You're acting like a psychopath." They waited for my defense. They provided the friction, expecting me to provide the spark. I set my ceramic mug on the table. I leaned forward, bringing my face closer to the camera, ensuring they could see the unyielding coldness in my eyes. I spoke in a quiet, measured cadence, wielding my words with the clinical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "You cannot gift an asset you do not own," I stated clearly. The sentence hung in the digital space between us. Tom opened his mouth to shout, but my steady tone sliced right through his rising volume. The deed was solely in my name. I continued enunciating every syllable to ensure the facts penetrated their cognitive dissonance. "I did not require your permission to alter my living situation. The property was legally sold to an investment holding company at 2:14 yesterday afternoon. The wire has cleared into a secure account. The title is finalized. You are currently trespassing on corporate property." The machinery of their delusion shattered against the bedrock of the law. I watched the realization wash over Tom's face. The crimson hue of his skin faded into a sickly pale gray. He lowered the phone slightly, the camera angle dropping to show his chin and the busy street behind him before he hastily brought it back up. "You sold it!" Tom stammered, the authoritative bark vanishing from his throat. He sounded like a man who just discovered the floor beneath him was made of thin ice. "You sold a family home. You gave away our real estate to a stranger." "I did not give away anything." I corrected, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "I liquidated a privately held asset. I secured my equity. The transaction is permanent. Brenda snatched the phone from his hands. The camera shook wildly before focusing on her tear-streaked face. She abandoned the commanding tone and resorted to the tactic that served her best for 32 years. She weaponized maternal sorrow. "Suri, how could you do this?" Brenda wept, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "We are your family. We are your blood. You just erased your pregnant sister's future. You cannot sell a house without telling us. You have to call the bank. You have to reverse the sale. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you changed your mind." The sheer ignorance of her demand highlighted the depth of their entitlement. They treated a complex commercial real estate transaction like a sweater purchased in the wrong size. They believed the law would bend to accommodate their emotional discomfort. Real estate contracts do not have a return policy. "Mom, the ink is dry. The buyer already changed the locks. If you do not leave that sidewalk, the new owner will have you arrested for loitering." Lauren wailed loudly in the background, sliding down the side of the yellow truck until she sat on the hot pavement. Seth knelt beside her, patting her shoulder with awkward, ineffective motions. Brenda stared at me through the screen, her tears failing to produce the desired effect. The guilt trip was her final remaining weapon, and she prepared to swing it with everything she had left. "You betrayed us!" Brenda cried, pressing her hand over her heart. "We welcomed you to this island. We taught you the meaning of our traditions. You destroyed our ohana. You took a sacred bond and you threw it in the trash just to be spiteful." I looked at the woman who spent my entire life minimizing my achievements. The mother who referred to my grueling technical career as a hobby, the parent who sat in silence while my father gave away the roof over my head. I felt the final tether of obligation snap, leaving behind a clean, pristine detachment. I shut the performance down with a swift, undeniable recitation of the facts. "You stole my key," I replied, my gaze locking onto hers through the digital feed. "You waited until I walked out of the room, you dug through my personal belongings, and you took a key to my home. You ambushed me at a holiday dinner. You cornered me in front of 15 relatives so I would be too embarrassed to defend myself. That was not ohana. That was theft. I just made sure you could not complete the transaction." Brenda stopped crying. The tears froze on her cheeks. The unvarnished truth stripped away the noble narrative she constructed around their attempted robbery. She could not argue the facts. She could not deny the stolen key or the public ambush. The reality of their own malice was reflected right back at them, leaving them exposed and defenseless on a crowded street corner. Tom reached for the phone again, his face reappearing in the frame. The patriarchal authority was gone, replaced by the desperate, flailing panic of a man realizing his community standing was about to evaporate. He looked at the useless rental truck, the weeping daughter, and the failed scheme. His pride required a target, and since he could no longer steal my home, he decided to attack my future. Seth stepped up beside him, his face twisting into an ugly sneer, preparing to launch a threat that would shift the battleground from a locked door to a court of law. Seth shoved his way into the center of the video frame. His face was twisted into a scowl that failed to mask the underlying panic of a man realizing his free ride had vanished. He jabbed his finger toward the camera lens, trying to project a commanding presence that his track record simply did not support. He puffed out his chest, attempting to salvage his bruised ego in front of his weeping wife and frantic in-laws. He raised his voice, adopting a pseudo-legal tone he probably gleaned from watching television dramas. He informed me that they had a binding verbal contract. He insisted the announcement at the Christmas dinner, performed in front of 15 witnesses, constituted a legally enforceable agreement. He promised to file an injunction against the property sale. He threatened to drag me into court, drain my bank accounts, and sue me for emotional distress fraud and breach of promise. He shouted that his attorneys would tie up the condo deed in litigation for years until I surrendered. I listened to his tirade without interrupting. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the warm liquid steady my nerves. Seth was relying on the classic bully tactic of overwhelming the target with legal jargon to force a surrender. He forgot that my daily routine involved negotiating complex vendor contracts and navigating dense compliance regulations. Empty threats did not register on my radar. When he paused to take a breath, I responded. I kept my voice stripped of any emotional resonance. I did not debate his fictional legal theories. I countered with stark reality. I provided him with the full name and office contact information for Diane, my real estate attorney. I recited the details clearly, suggesting he write them down. I advised him to consult the statute of frauds, a legal principle dictating that any transfer of real estate must be executed in writing to hold any validity. I calmly explained that a stolen key and a dinner party speech did not override a registered notarized deed. Then I addressed the core of his threat. I reminded Seth that filing a frivolous lawsuit requires a substantial financial retainer. I pointed out that my legal counsel would immediately file a motion to dismiss, followed by a countersuit demanding he cover all my attorney fees. I asked him directly and coldly how a man who recently defaulted on a designer ice delivery service and an incomplete dog walking application planned to finance a protracted legal battle against a corporate investment syndicate. I suggested that exposing his financial insolvency in the public record would likely hinder his future attempts to secure venture capital for whatever imaginary business he planned to launch next. Seth closed his mouth. The bluster drained out of him, leaving him looking hollow and exhausted. His jaw ticked, but he offered no rebuttal. He stepped back from the camera, retreating to the side of the yellow rental truck. The legal avenue was closed. The financial route was blocked. But the true devastation awaiting my parents was not legal or financial. It was social. I watched Brenda peer into the screen, her eyes darting nervously. Her real problem was currently sitting in the living room of her Kailua home. 15 extended relatives from Ohio were occupying her guest rooms and sleeping on inflatable mattresses. Those aunts, uncles, and cousins had cheered for the holiday miracle. They had raised their glasses to toast my supposed generosity. They watched my father bestow the key. Now they were waiting for Lauren to post pictures of the new nursery. They were expecting joyous updates from moving day. Instead, they were about to witness a catastrophic unraveling. I mapped out the inevitable sequence of events for my parents right there on the video call. I asked Brenda how she planned to explain the situation to Aunt Karen, who had wept tears of joy over the gift. I inquired what Tom would tell Uncle Dave, who praised his patriarchal wisdom. The relatives were going to ask questions. They would want to know why the moving truck returned fully loaded. They would ask why Lauren was sobbing in the driveway. The truth possesses a unique property. It cannot be contained once a crack forms in the container. The story would leak. The extended family would inevitably discover that the generous holiday gesture was actually a coordinated, non-consensual seizure of my assets. They would learn that Tom rummaged through my purse while I served them appetizers. They would realize the heartwarming Christmas memory they flew across the ocean to witness was a staged robbery, and they had unwittingly acted as the cheering audience. The realization washed over Brenda's face. The color vanished from her cheeks. In our family, appearances dictated survival. Brenda spent decades cultivating the persona of the flawless, generous matriarch. She governed her neighborhood association, hosted elaborate luncheons, and maintained an immaculate public image. That image was the foundation of her entire identity. The narrative was about to flip. The gossip network would activate. The aunts would call the cousins on the mainland. The story would spread through the island's social circles. Tom and Brenda would transform from revered community pillars into cautionary tales. They would become the punchline of country club whispers, the parents who tried to steal their own daughter's home and got locked out by a corporate buyer, the parents who handed out a fake key to cover their own greed. Narcissists do not fear anger. They feed on your rage because it proves they affect you. They do not fear logic because they can twist facts to suit their narrative. The only consequence a narcissist truly fears is public embarrassment. The stripping away of the mask in front of an audience they cannot control is their ultimate nightmare. I was handing them that nightmare. You wanted to make a public spectacle, I told my mother, my eyes fixed on her panicked expression. You wanted the audience. You wanted the applause. Now you get to go back to the house and explain the encore. I hope the rental deposit on the truck was refundable. Tom lunged for the phone, shouting my name, demanding I listen to him, attempting to assert one final desperate measure of control. He wanted to argue. He needed the friction to feel powerful. I denied him the friction. I did not offer a dramatic closing statement. I did not hurl insults. I simply removed my finger from the side of the ceramic coffee mug and extended it toward the glowing screen. I tapped the red button. The video feed vanished. The chaotic, sweating faces of my family disappeared, replaced by the serene background image on my phone display. The audio feed cut out instantly, severing the shouting, the weeping, and the relentless noise that had plagued my existence for 32 years. The quiet inside the Seattle coffee shop rushed back in to fill the void. The soft hum of the espresso machine and the low murmur of other patrons replaced the toxic static of my former life. I set the phone face down on the table. The digital tether was permanently severed. I left them standing on a sweltering sidewalk in Waikiki, burdened with an hourly truck rental fee, a useless piece of brass, and a shattered reputation they could never repair. The conflict was over. They had built their own cage, and I had simply provided the lock. I turned my gaze toward the window, watching the snowflakes drift against the glass, letting the crisp, unblemished reality of my new environment wash over me. The storm behind me was finished, and the horizon ahead was remarkably clear. 6 months have passed since I tapped the red button and ended that video call. The transition from the tropical heat to the crisp, steady chill of the Pacific Northwest provided a necessary physical and mental reset. I did not rent a small apartment. I took the wired funds from the Waikiki sale and purchased a spacious loft in the Pioneer Square district of Seattle. The space features exposed brick walls, heavy timber beams, and tall industrial windows that frame the distant gray waters of Puget Sound. When the rain falls, it creates a steady, rhythmic drumming against the glass, a sound that wraps the entire space in a profound, insulating quiet. My home is a fortress. Nobody holds a spare key. Nobody expects me to surrender my square footage. The professional environment in my new city offered an equally stark contrast to my previous life. I stepped into the role of information technology director for a rapidly expanding logistics firm. I manage a dedicated team of engineers, oversee a complex infrastructure budget, and report directly to the executive board. My colleagues do not view my career as a tedious hobby or a temporary distraction. They respect my expertise. When the workday concludes, my boundaries remain intact. There are no mandatory weekend shifts to cover someone else's incompetence. There are no frantic holiday emergencies designed to test my loyalty. I earn a substantial salary, and every single dollar belongs to me. I no longer spend my evenings waiting for a frantic phone call demanding a bridge loan to rescue an aspiring entrepreneur who refuses to set an alarm clock. The Island Gossip Network operated exactly as I predicted. Information traveled rapidly through the extended relatives and the neighborhood associations. A cousin from Ohio sent me a brief, tentative message in early spring, breaking the digital silence. She did not demand an explanation. She offered an apology. The cousin revealed that the narrative Tom and Brenda attempted to spin collapsed under the weight of basic scrutiny. The aunts and uncles demanded to know why Lauren was weeping next to an empty moving truck. The truth surfaced. The neighborhood realized that the generous holiday miracle was a staged, non-consensual seizure of my assets. My parents faced a swift, severe social exile. The prestigious luncheon invitations ceased. The country club whispers grew loud enough to hear. Lauren and Seth were forced to break their new lease and move into a cramped, outdated duplex far outside the city center. Seth had to abandon his startup dreams and accept an entry-level sales position to cover their mounting debts. I read the update, felt a brief wave of closure, and archived the message. I did not reply. Their reality is no longer my concern. I want to pause here and examine the mechanics of what actually occurred inside that dining room on Christmas Eve. We need to dissect the psychological architecture that allows a family to justify theft. The first pillar of their strategy is financial enmeshment. In a healthy dynamic, resources are shared willingly with clear boundaries and mutual respect. In a toxic system, the boundaries are intentionally blurred. The individual achievements of the designated worker are treated as a collective pool of wealth, while the debts of the favorite child are treated as a shared burden. Financial enmeshment trains the scapegoat to view their own success as a shared commodity. It conditions the target to feel guilty for possessing a savings account. The enmeshed family views your independence as a threat. They do not celebrate your financial stability. They survey it, measure it, and look for ways to redirect it toward the weakest link. They convince themselves that your money is their money simply because you share a genetic origin. The second pillar is the weaponization of cultural values. Every society holds beautiful unifying concepts. In Hawaii, the concept of ohana represents deep, unconditional support and mutual care. But manipulators will take a sacred tradition and hollow it out wearing the skin of the culture to disguise their greed. They use words like loyalty, sacrifice, and family first as emotional blunt instruments. They demand that you honor the tradition by emptying your pockets, all while they violate the very core of that same tradition by treating you with profound disrespect. When a relative uses your cultural heritage to induce guilt, they are not preserving a legacy. They are executing a shakedown. They are relying on your reverence for the culture to blind you to their exploitation. The final and most dangerous pillar is the exploitation of the social contract. The social contract is an invisible agreement we sign to keep society functioning smoothly. We smile when we are uncomfortable. We clap when prompted. Narcissists study this conditioning and use it as a weapon. They stage their ambushes in public. They present a stolen key in front of 15 cheering witnesses. They calculate that the target will feel too much social pressure to reject the demand. They bet their entire strategy on your good manners. They know you will suffer in silence rather than ruin a holiday dinner. They assume you will swallow your dignity to protect the festive atmosphere. If you take anything away from my story, let it be this. You do not owe politeness to a person who is actively dismantling your future. Setting a firm, unyielding boundary is not a betrayal of your family. Stealing a daughter's hard-earned sanctuary to furnish a favorite child's life is the betrayal. Walking away from an abusive dynamic is a valid, healthy response to an invalid, toxic demand. You are not required to participate in a play where you are cast as the sacrificial lamb. You have the right to stand up, exit the stage, and write your own script in a different theater. You are allowed to protect your peace, your assets, and your sanity. The sun is beginning to set over the Seattle skyline. The sky shifts into deep shades of indigo and violet, casting long shadows across the harbor. I stand near the tall windows of my loft, holding a fresh cup of coffee, feeling the residual warmth of the ceramic against my skin. The city below is alive with movement, a grid of bright headlights and glowing office towers. I look out over the vast, sprawling urban landscape. I feel entirely untethered from the humid, suffocating expectations of my past. I am not angry. I am not vengeful. I am simply free. My parents believed they could trap me with a shiny piece of brass and a cheering crowd. They failed to realize that true power does not reside in loud arguments or desperate maneuvers. Narcissists crave the screaming match because the screaming match is a negotiation. When you are yelling, you are still in the room. When you are silent, you are gone. You never need to raise your voice to win a battle against entitled people. You never need to scream to prove your worth. You just need to walk away in silence, protect your assets, and build a life they can never touch.
The collapse of a family rarely sounds like a sudden, deafening explosion. More often, it echoes in the quiet clinking of silverware at a holiday dinner, or the subtle shifting of a foundational beam rotting from the inside out. When searching for the catalyst that shatters a home, society frequently looks for a singular, malicious villain. The truth is far more insidious. Families are frequently dismantled by the very individuals tasked with holding them together, armed with good intentions, misplaced values, and a profound lack of emotional awareness. In America, we walk a precarious tightrope between championing individualism, where self-reliance and impenetrable boundaries mark a successful adult, and harboring a nostalgic yearning for traditional family support. But what happens when that sanctuary becomes a snare? What occurs when unifying concepts of family loyalty are hollowed out and weaponized to enforce strict compliance and extract hard-earned resources? The most profound tragedy in dysfunctional parenting is the silent horror of favoritism. It is a slow-acting poison that permanently alters the psychological architecture of every child involved. When parents distribute their love, validation, and financial resources unequally, they do not merely elevate one child, they actively sabotage them all. Consider the golden child, shielded from the consequences of their reckless actions. Parents who rush to pay off impulsive debts or rescue their favorite from self-inflicted chaos believe they are providing a safety net. In reality, they are weaving a suffocating web of perpetual infancy, breeding a profound sense of entitlement. These children walk into society completely stripped of the essential survival skills required to navigate accountability, failure, and the uncompromising realities of the adult world. Conversely, the overlooked child is expected to endlessly endure the family's dysfunction. When their boundaries are ignored and achievements minimized, they learn a devastating lesson. Their worth is entirely conditional upon their utility to others. They learn to meticulously build fortresses around their hearts and their assets. The tragedy here is not that this alienated child forgets how to love. It is that the family's blatant unfairness teaches them how to walk away. They do not learn the art of healthy compromise. Instead, they are taught how to sever ties completely in order to protect their own sanity and the fruits of their disciplined labor. This toxic dynamic is frequently masked by the invocation of sacred traditions. In American society, phrases like family first, or cultural cornerstones like the Hawaiian concept of ohana, are beautifully designed to weave a fabric of safety, belonging, and mutual respect. However, in the hands of manipulative parents, these concepts are twisted into tools for emotional extortion. Tradition should never be utilized as a crowbar to pry open a child's bank account or steal their peace of mind. A genuine functional family structure operates strictly on the principles of informed consent and voluntary support. True generosity flows organically from uncoerced love, not from the suffocating pressure of familial obligation or the manufactured guilt of a cheering crowd. Parents lacking emotional awareness fail to recognize that this emotional taxation destroys the very unity they claim to protect. Raising children to become functional, thriving adults requires parents to embrace a fundamental long-term shift in their role. As children mature, parents must gracefully transition from being absolute managers of their lives to serving as objective, supportive guides. They cannot function as a limitless financial institution, dispensing endless bailouts to cover up impulsive business ventures, or an illusionary lifestyle that far exceeds a child's grasp. Allowing an adult child to face the natural consequences of their mistakes is not a failure of parental love. It is the crucible where true independence is forged. Furthermore, parents must demonstrate fairness by valuing all forms of honest work equally. Elevating a flashy, superficial lifestyle while dismissing the quiet, steady grind of a stable career creates dangerous cognitive dissonance. It warps a child's understanding of the inherent dignity of labor, actively endorsing a value system built entirely on smoke and mirrors. The ultimate test of a traditional family structure lies in its ability to respect absolute boundaries once the children reach adulthood. This relationship must evolve from a dynamic of parental control to one of profound mutual respect. An adult child's assets, time, and property are completely sovereign. Their hard-earned property is not a communal family asset waiting to be redistributed to satisfy a parent's desperate desire to play the benevolent savior. Too often, parents fall into the destructive trap of performing for an audience that simply does not matter. They become obsessed with maintaining the pristine illusion of the perfect family in the eyes of their neighbors and extended relatives. They force their children to play mandated roles in a theatrical production designed solely to protect a fragile reputation. But a facade of perfection is a poor substitute for the messy, honest reality of genuine human connection. When truth is sacrificed for appearances, the foundation of the home turns to ash. Modern family education and long-term guidance must firmly reject these toxic paradigms. We must actively move away from the destructive habits of forced equality, where the responsible individuals are relentlessly coerced into carrying the burdens of the reckless. We must abandon the use of emotional blackmail masquerading as time-honored tradition. Instead, we must build families rooted in a healthy, empowering foundation that passionately encourages individual effort, enforces strict personal responsibility, and publicly celebrates the setting of healthy boundaries. A truly strong family is not one where individuality is erased for the sake of collective comfort. It is a space where fiercely independent, self-reliant individuals choose to stand together out of genuine mutual respect. These quiet dramas play out behind closed doors in neighborhoods across the country every single day. They are the stories of ordinary people making impossible choices, painstakingly untangling knots of lifelong obligation, and finding the profound courage to choose their own peace over a fabricated harmony. If you have ever felt the suffocating weight of these expectations, if you have ever had to build a formidable wall to protect your own future, you understand that setting a boundary is not an act of war. It is a necessary act of survival. To hear more stories of quiet resilience of families navigating the difficult terrain of truth and boundaries, and of people learning to build lives that belong entirely to them, make sure to follow the channel. Still Drama Stories. As the dust settles on the conflicts we leave behind, we are left to ponder the true architecture of our own lives. The traditions we inherit are only as strong as the unvarnished truth they are built upon. So the next time you sit around a crowded holiday table listening to the clinking of glasses and the comforting familiar hum of conversation, take a quiet moment to look at the faces surrounding you. Listen closely to the silence between the spoken words. You might just find yourself wondering who is truly there to build a home and who is merely waiting to collect the rent.